Hi everyone, my name's Charlie. I'm really excited this evening, and today we're here for a debate about AI safety, and in particular the question, is artificial intelligence an existential threat to humanity? I thought I'd say a few words about why I think this question is important. 2023 was a really big year for concerns about AI risk. We had this letter calling for the pause to AI development in March, which had lots of signatories. And later on, we had a slightly more strongly worded public statement saying that the risk of extinction from AI should be a global priority, alongside other societal scale risks such as pandemics and nuclear war. And both of these were signed by pretty important people, including people like Jeffrey Hinton, Joshua Bengio, pretty high profile people in the AI space. And as you see from both of these are about very large scale risks from AI. In addition to you could say more like smaller scale risks from unemployment or biased algorithms. These are talking about the larger scale risks from AI systems, which is a reason to be concerned, perhaps. But aside from experts who think this is a problem, you also have really prominent experts saying that this is just not a problem at all. You have people like Melanie Mitchell saying that the risks are basically next to zero, and similarly with other prominent AI scientists. So this is personally for me a question which I think is really important, but I'm also really uncertain about. And my hope for the debate this evening is that we can together try and clarify some of these uncertainties that perhaps not just I have, but other people also have, and we can have an interesting discussion. So, a little word on the format. We're going to have 4 presentations from each of our speakers, who Maya will be introducing shortly. And then we're going to have a moderated Q&A with Tom, with Tom asking questions. And then we're going to open it up to audience questions. Okay, so now I'm going to pass over to Ivana, who is going to introduce the other organisers here.
Yes, I'm Ivana. I am the head of events at UCL AI Society. We worked really hard to organize this event, and we have really exciting speakers today. But first of all, we have to address the elephant in the room, which is the fact that all our invited speakers are white men working in tech, which is not exactly the most novel combo, isn't it? We did try to invite some female speakers, but unfortunately they cannot make it tonight. And of course, they're just more male options, Caucasian options to start with from the beginning. I would like to invite you all today to bear this in mind as you listen to the debate and think about how gender biases and one's positionality shape perspective and behaviors. And instead of avoiding biases and differences, let's find a way to celebrate it. And I'll pass it to Maya to introduce who our speakers are today.
Yes, so first up we have Chris Watkins on the left. He's a professor of computer science at Royal Holloway. Chris is a leading expert in reinforcement learning algorithms. Alongside him is Reuben Adams, a PhD student in AI at UCL and the host of the Theory AI podcast. Both of them will share why they see AI as a potential threat. On the other side, we have Jack Stilgoe, Professor of Science and Technology Studies at UCL, and a key figure in the UK's Responsible AI program. Joining Jack is Kenneth, Cukier, Deputy Executive Editor at the Economist in London, and the co-host of the Babbage Tech podcast. They'll argue that AI, while powerful, is not an existential threat. The moderator tonight is Tom Ough, a freelance writer whose work has featured in newspapers and magazines, including Prospect, BBC, Future, The Telegraph, and other publications. He'll guide our discussions. Okay, over to you, Tom.
Well, I think we're going to start with Reuben on proposition. All right, I'm going to stand up because this chair is extremely wobbly and I don't fall off during my 1 point of order. Everyone has 7 minutes and I'll give you 1 minute. All right. Okay, so thank you to everyone organising this. I'm very happy to be here, and especially for the opposition. I think it's extremely hard to get people involved in this discussion if they're sceptical of it. So I want to thank you both for being here. All right, so whether AI is an existential existential threat depends exactly on how we create it. I want to make the argument that the current deep learning paradigm does not exactly inspire confidence. Before the deep learning revolution in the 2010s, AI consisted of carefully crafted algorithms solving specific tasks. We understood how the algorithms worked, what they could and what they could not do. Now, deep learning is totally different. Just like you can train a dog without understanding how a dog's brain works, we can train enormous neural networks to accomplish complex tasks without having the faintest clue how exactly they end up doing it. By default, they're black boxes. This is why controlling AI is currently a cat and mouse game. Preventing ChatGPT from ever giving the recipe for mustard gas would require understanding where that knowledge was stored and then removing it. And this is something we currently have no idea how to do. But not only are neural networks black boxes, their capabilities are unpredictable. Take the GPT models again. They're trained to predict the next word in reams of text, which seems like a stupid task until you realize that to do it well, you need to be able to translate multiple languages. You need to write code, model human emotions, and hundreds of other abilities. Now, GPT-3 picked up more of these abilities than GPT-2, and GPT-4 picked up even more. But currently, we have no way of knowing in advance which capabilities will be picked up. We just have to try it and see. Now, all of these capabilities were previously attacked separately with specialized algorithms. This is good old-fashioned AI. But we now see that they can largely be solved in one fell swoop once you have the clever idea of the transformer. You just need mountains of data and huge computational resources. And this is a trend across the whole field of AI. Progress is now largely driven by increases in data and compute, rather than clever algorithms or deep insights. In fact, it is shockingly easy to build advanced AI systems, something Richard Sutton, the father of reinforcement learning, refers to as, quote, the bitter lesson. It seems at least plausible, therefore, that we could reach all the way up to human-level AI with only a few further theoretical insights, the timing of which are incredibly hard to predict. Now, the simplest forecast takes current trends and projects them forward. This would predict that we will continue to build ever more capable black box AI systems, that their capabilities will begin to rival our own across the board, that we will not be able to predict these capabilities in advance, and that we will find them difficult to control. Not exactly a reassuring situation. But is it existential? If things got bad, couldn't we just switch them off? I think this is economically and politically naive. If AIs are controlled by private corporations, they will likely continue to put profit ahead of ethics, as we've already seen. If they are controlled by governments, they will be too slow to react. And if they are open source, well then good luck switching them off. Now for some speculation. There will be economic incentives toward creating AIs capable of pursuing long-term goals. Customers will want AIs to do things for them with minimal oversight, whether that's replying to emails, running a branch of a company, or orchestrating a battlefield strategy. Now, the problem with goal-driven AI is that almost whatever its goal is, it can't be achieved if it's switched off. In the words of Stuart Russell, you can't fetch the coffee if you're dead. Any goal-driven AI with the capacity to make this inference automatically, therefore, has a self-preservation instinct. It automatically sees anyone seeking to shut it down as an obstacle. In the words of Norbert Wiener, we had better be quite sure that the purpose put into the machine is the purpose which we really desire, and not merely a colourful imitation of it. Okay, but why would we put in the wrong goal? How hard can it be? First, do you really trust large AI companies to use their technology simply to pursue not to simply pursue their own interests? Second, AIs often display shocking ingenuity in pursuing the letter of our instructions at the expense of their intent. This phenomenon, dubbed reward hacking, will only get worse with something as complex as human values. Third, we simply do not yet have a reliable method for accurately imbuing neural networks with goals. The best we have is reinforcement learning, which occasionally produces capable agents with the wrong goal. We are in a similar position to evolution. Humans have essentially been trained over thousands of years to maximize inclusive genetic fitness. But instead, we internalized as our goals things that only correlate with this, such as sex and calorific foods. Hundreds of thousands of years of training still weren't enough to get the right goal. Given these difficulties, I tentatively predict the following. We will create AIs capable of pursuing long-term goals. Economic and political pressures will encourage risk-taking in races for market share and political dominance. Eventually, one of these systems will not only be rational enough to infer self-preservation as a necessary sub-goal, but capable enough to pursue it. Terminators? I don't think so. Perhaps AIs will gradually destroy our ability to cooperate by taking advantage of the systems already eroding our shared understanding of the world, such as mass disinformation, persuasion, and manipulation. If we cannot coordinate, we cannot direct our future. At that point, we had better hope that whichever company built the AI systems did a good job of imbuing them with the complexity of human values, rather than merely a colourful imitation of them. Now, any specific story about the future is likely to be false, but this whole class of stories, ending with humans losing control of a complex technology they do not understand, pursuing goals they did not intend, is disturbingly plausible. Last year, the AI Impact Survey asked nearly 3,000 AI experts published in top journals when they expected we would have high-level machine intelligence, something they defined as machines that can, quote, accomplish every task better and more cheaply than human workers. The results were, frankly, all over the place. We simply do not know when this technology will arrive. Anyone saying it is an extremely far time away needs some humility. We've been very shocked by the speed of technological progress, in particular in AI, in the last few years. We could be shocked again. Maybe we would only have to be surprised about 2 or 3 times in order to get to human-level AI. I want to finish with a story. In 1933, the physicist Ernest Rutherford expressed skepticism of nuclear energy, saying, quote, anyone who looked for a source of power in the transformation of the atoms was talking moonshine. The next day, Leo Szilard conceived of the nuclear chain reaction. Predicting technological progress is hard. Let's ask now what would happen if the large AI companies achieved their explicit goal of creating human-level AI. Thank you for having me. Thank you, Reuben. And now, speaking against the motion, we will have Jack.
Thank you all. Thank you so much for having me. So I'm a UCL home player. I've just come from 3 hours of seminar teaching, so I'm a little bit sort of frazzled. This feels like a bit of a sort of break after that. So I think it's worth noting, Reuben mentioned the Leo Szilard story at the end. It's worth noting for UCL people, the story goes that Leo Szilard came up with the insight about the chain reaction while crossing the road at the junction of Russell Square and Southampton Row. So if any of you are ever feeling like you need a flash of insight and you need somewhere to go, that's quite a good place to visit the traffic lights to see if you can do something similar. But I think the Szilard story tells us something quite important about scientific responsibility, about the anticipation of risks. Leo Szilard was not just the person that came up with the idea of the chain reaction, he was also the person that patented the atomic bomb, and then the person that persuaded Albert Einstein to write to the then President of the United States to begin the process that would result in the Manhattan Project. Now, I'm a social scientist. I'm comfortable in history and social science. I'm much less comfortable in computer science. Let me just start off by doing a bit of social science. So hands up those of you that think that artificial intelligence does present an existential risk. We're in trouble, Ken. Hands up those of you who think it definitely doesn't. And hands up those of you who had never thought about it before coming into this room. Okay, so we are in the minority. Hands up those of you that have seen Oppenheimer. Good, yes. Again, UCL connection. UCL alumnus Christopher Nolan. And in fact, his wife, the producer of Oppenheimer, even mentioned the UCL Film Society at her BAFTA acceptance speech. So that's a nice one. Oppenheimer, I think, tells us really interesting story about existential risk. There's a danger that AI people only watch the first bit of Oppenheimer and don't realise the actual message of the film. So there's a scene near the start where Oppenheimer is talking to General Groves, and they are talking about the potential existential risk of testing a nuclear weapon and a theoretical possibility that it will set fire to the atmosphere and destroy the entire planet. And the joke is that you can't say that there's zero risk of this happening, but General Groves, played by Matt Damon, is nevertheless still quite upset by the whole business. My worry would be that if people thinking about artificial intelligence stop there, they might think that that's the moral of the story. And actually, the moral of the story comes at the end of the film, when Oppenheimer is talking to Einstein, when the exchange is that, yes, they did contribute to starting a chain reaction, but it wasn't that chain reaction. It was a chain reaction of what we social scientists would call a socio-technical form, an interaction of people and things that led to the proliferation of a socio-technical system that destabilized the world. Let's not get into an argument about whether the hydrogen bomb destabilized or stabilized the world. Shouldn't have gone there. So I'm a social scientist, but I spend most of my time hanging out with computer scientists. I'm part of a big program called Responsible AI. Responsible AI is a 5-year program. We launched in the summer. We're funded by UK Research and Innovation. A bunch of ministers at London Tech Week in the summer announced our program alongside a bunch of other good things in terms of artificial intelligence. The same week, the front page of the Times told us that within 2 years we'd all be dead because of artificial intelligence, right? It's a really, really seductive story. It's a really, really pleasing story. As a social scientist, I'm afraid I'm going to do the rather annoying thing, which is to not answer the question, even though I would agree with Melanie Mitchell that that the existential risks of artificial intelligence are not really worth spending much time thinking about. I'm interested in wondering where this idea came from. How did this idea become so popular and catch on so quickly when it seems so strange? This idea, and what does the idea distract us from? So I believe that the idea of existential risk from artificial intelligence is a form of displacement activity. I believe it stops us from asking really important questions about artificial intelligence, about technology, about the politics of technology. I've spent my whole career working on different new technologies. And across all of them, the sorts of things that I'm interested in asking are questions like, who actually benefits? Who is put at risk? Who's making the decisions? Right? Those are political questions about our future. Now, we know that technology is an increasingly important part of shaping that future. So it's really important that we ask those questions, right? Questions, who benefits? Who's at risk? Who decides? There's a danger that when we're talking about existential risk, it immediately stamps all over that discussion, because it's imagined that the battle is one between humans and robots, right? Which is a very, very easy, seductive narrative. There are lots and lots of stories written about exactly that battle. 1 minute. But it doesn't tell you anything about humans versus humans. And actually, when it comes to technologies, technologies are all about power. We shouldn't be worrying about what robots will do to humanity. Instead, what we should be worrying about is what some people will do to other people using technologies. We should be worrying about how we can better share the benefits of technology, to mean that the people that normally lose out from technological change this time benefit from it. We should be clear that the people that are already most marginalized in society risk being further marginalized with artificial intelligence. To tell them that the risk that matters is an existential one to all of humanity is to ignore exactly those sorts of concerns. I'm really glad that the question of gender was brought up, because there are some really important lessons from feminist sociology, and I'll just end on this point. Feminist sociology tells us that the risks that we see are likely to depend upon where we stand. If you ask people who aren't in the sort of privileged, rarefied environment that we are in, what they regard as the risks of artificial intelligence, they would see the existential risk discussion as fantastically vague, meaningless. They would say that it serves the interests, ironically, of the people developing the technology, that it contributes to the hype that is such a source of concern, and that it overlooks all of the risks that we actually already know about when it comes to artificial intelligence. Risks like misinformation, risks like the disempowerment of workers, risks like infringements of copyrights. All of those sorts of things are the things that we should be concerned about. Spending lots of time, money, talking about existential risk means that we're not talking about those things. That's all.
Thank you very much. Now for our second speaker on the proposition side, Chris.
Right. Well, why are we here? We are here because about a year ago, OpenAI released a program called ChatGPT, which was stunningly different from previous technology. For the first time, we can put, well, neither are open source LLMs nearly as powerful. You can get the world's verbal knowledge in your laptop, on your desk, and talk to it. That is astonishing. It came about because of a series of quite pedestrian engineering changes, and one particular change in the architecture of deep neural networks, which is expressible in about this much code on your screen, and which my students are currently implementing as an exercise in their MSc course. Whoa. Sometimes there are events. This is one of them. Now, I think a reasonable thing to do is to try to look into the future, which is very hard, and think about what may happen either tomorrow or the day after tomorrow, next year or the year after next, sometime in the future. It's not minimizing people's concerns, it's simply being reasonable to try to make some kinds of forecasts of what there is to come. And what there is to come is quite astonishing. The slow road there is reverse engineering the brain. That turns out to be really hard. Are there any neuroscientists here? I mean, it's slow. The quick road is to try to invent algorithms, like reinforcement learning or other things. And we can't forecast when that'll be, but our present algorithms are really simple. Now, these large language models are giving us the first taste of super usable machines. Machines where you indicate your intent and they fulfill it, frequently wrongly. If you get them to write code, it's usually wrong. They're artificial, they're general, and they're just a little bit intelligent. Let's go with one thing they can't do. Many of you will have had an experience in childhood when you start counting. And you ask what comes after 20, and it's 21. What comes after 40, and it's 41. And you realize then you can go on forever. And this is an intellectual awakening. Counting is an ability which you can apply and connect with many other mental skills. You can use it to check your addition and so on, and learn about one-to-one correspondence. And you can develop a repertoire of intellectual skills. You can apply resourcefully, and it's inherently self-modifying, open-ended, and expanding. We didn't evolve to count. That's not an evolutionary skill developed by evolution. Large language models have read every school book on counting and long multiplication there is, and they still can't do it. They give wonderfully glib answers. It's really quite comical. Now, what it's reasonable to suppose is that over the next, I don't know, 2, 5, 10, 15 years, people will come up with further, relatively simple architectural modifications, because there are about 20,000 people in the world furiously trying to do just that right now. Now, if you get, the present epoch of AI is about big data. We pump enormous amounts of data through very stupid algorithms to produce brittle systems which can occasionally do useful things, not actually nearly as useful as it's made out to be. And if we get to, say, the next stage of, if you like, self-modifying resourceful cognition, where does it stop? Do we get to human-level AI? Well, of course not. It's the start of an exponential. You go further. There's no reason to suppose that the size, resourcefulness, or speed, or scope of artificial computation will be less than or equal to our small brains in our skulls. No reason at all. In fact, there's every reason to suppose it's going to be better. It's open to us to design systems with learning rules which are better than the learning rules for the neurons in our brain, for example. So what's going to come? A series of, there are already, I think, 11-figure sums of investment in developing large language models, which aren't nearly as useful as people are saying. But when we have more capable AI, there are going to be an invention of open-ended intellectual self-improvement and dexterous, purposeful, independent robots, so that the transition in technology is going to be something comparable or bigger than the Industrial Revolution. I don't say that lightly. We're going from technologies where it's really hard and requires the intense cooperation of very large numbers of people to build something very complicated, to something where you can indicate intent, and the technology, building the technology becomes radically easier. You get technology which, as it were, builds itself. Whoa, is this dangerous? Well, after some decades, it becomes unimaginable. But my favorite dangers, as always, are other people. Returning to the atomic bomb and the Manhattan Project, it's quite a good example. The Manhattan Project was a mistake. It started because people feared the Germans were building a bomb. They weren't. It was unnecessary. It needn't have happened. We might still never have built or exploded atomic bombs by international agreement. But politics said otherwise. Politics is going to come. My favorite risks are war and tyranny. But there's also the unimaginable with AI. Thank you, Chris.
To round things off, on the opposition side, we have Kenneth.
This is Blink. Open-ended intellectual improvement. Check it out. AI that is dedicated to self-preservation as Reuben has rightly said. Can both of these pillars of their argument be entirely false and without merit? No. There is some merit to what they're saying. But will it represent an existential risk? No, it won't. Let's examine the points individually and see where it comes down in terms of how AI works and how AI probably will work in the future. Let's take Reuben's first point about this idea of self-preservation. Okay. What is it founded on? Why would the AI naturally have self-preservation? Well, AI doesn't actually have anything by nature. It has its training data in it. That's how it works. And so, because human beings are by nature self-preservational animals, so too, in the training data of AI, let's just look at an LLM, large language model, will be this concept of self-preservation. But it is an algorithm. It's a piece of silicon. It is not a human being. Human beings do have self-preservation. Why? Because we're mortal. Because we have a soul to damn and a body to kick. A transistor doesn't have those things. So it's actually artificial in its definitional way. It's a simulacrum of the thing. It's a layer of abstraction away from it. So what else is a layer of abstraction away from the thing itself? The actual output of AI. Let's look at the large language model specifically in terms of how it works. We take, in the case of the large language model, ChatGPT, we take all of the words that we can possibly find, preferably in English, but it's going to be cluttered as well with other things. We throw it into a space, we tokenize it turns it into math, we get all of that. But at its core, what it first does, the first part of the model, is makes relationships between the words so that it can look ahead and make a prediction for an autocomplete system, but at such a large scale that you can get paragraphs, not just words in an autocomplete. But that's actually the first part of the training. What's the second? There's 4 letters. Reinforcement learning from human feedback. So to Reuben's accurate point about mustard gas, if you ask for the recipe for mustard gas to ChatGPT, it will not tell you that. Now, sure, you can actually hack it and you can try to get it through the back door. And it's always going to be a cat and mouse. But the reason why you can't ask for the recipe of napalm or mustard gas is because human beings have been riven through the algorithm all the way through, so the output is highly controlled. Not good enough, it's going to get better. It's only been out for a year, a little bit more. So why is this so important? This idea of self-preservation is actually an instinct. It's hardwired in the human form because we have emotional abilities as well as reasoning, because we have a will to life. Now, interestingly, I use the term will to life very deliberately because in philosophy, Albert Schweitzer told us that I am a will to life amid others who have a will to life. And when I respect my will to life and theirs, my will to life transforms into a will to love. Nature becomes moral. So if human beings, again, at the high level of St. Teresa and of Albert Schweitzer, the great doctor of the 20th century, why is it that our AI will have a self-preservation and therefore be menacing and not a form of probably not self-preservation, but a form of preservation that is loving? No one can predict the future. That is what we've heard from everyone on stage today. And if that's the case, then there is no reason why we can't program our AIs to have some degree of control around what it produces. So now let's look at Chris's part of the argument, which is this idea that we'll have open-ended intellectual improvement. In some ways that it'll be run amok, it'll go outside of our control. Well, first, from what we've seen in terms of how the algorithm actually works today, it is very much in our control. We control the training data and we can control the output. In fact, an LLM like ChatGPT would not work to the standard that it does without having an army of people evaluating the output and then using those new weights in the reinforcement learning with human feedback back into the system and overweighting the randomness, that was actually non-random, but we'll call it the raw data, or it's not raw, the nakedness of the data from its first training run, right? So the human species is riven throughout it, and we can control it. So it's not going to be open-ended. But why do we think it might be? And that's interesting. So let's bring in Jack and his point. Why are we asking this question? It's because we love to anthropomorphize our tools, even if they're only tools. We see the image of someone with eyes and a nose and a mouth in a light socket. You can go online and look at tangerines and other fruits and bananas that look like human beings. And so too when it comes to technology, we can't help but see the golem on one side and the Frankenstein monster on the other. Now the Frankenstein monster is a very interesting one because of course the monster was just called the creature, and it was Victor Frankenstein, who was the doctor, who actually brought it into existence and into being. Now the creature himself was actually the Rousseauian state of nature, the man who was unencumbered with any sort of emotional or intellectual capability. He learned language by reading Paradise Lost by John Milton. He was actually a benevolent fellow who only wanted one thing: love, companionship. But it was the rest of humanity who was so cruel that it sort of cast him away, right? And then he became the monster from the book who tormented the creator, Frankenstein. So why I say that is because the human form, the human beings, are at the core of these instruments. These are tools, not beings. We are in control. The idea that it will take control is actually a human idea, that it will have some form of agency. But it doesn't have agency by its nature. We would have to give up our control to it. How likely is that to happen? The launch missile codes, are they going to be handed off to an LLM? No. Right? What about all the other ways in which an existential risk could take place? Paperclips. Thank you, Nick Bostrom of Oxford, who tells us that we're going to have an AI that is going to be instructed to make paperclips and therefore is going to run amok, colonize all of Earth in the pursuit of metals, then going intergalactic to make more and more paperclips, wiping out human beings who are going to try to interfere with its attempt to make paperclips. This is serious. This is what counts as analysis and philosophy at Oxford University. I mean, we can all agree you're lucky that you're at UCL. But this idea looks more and more implausible the closer you scrutinize the arguments. So is AI a risk? Yes, of course it's a risk. Across the street, across Gordon Street is the chemistry lab. It can blow London to smithereens if we let them. So there's lots of risks everywhere. But it is not an existential risk. And that's what is at its core. However, when we are discussing the problems with AI that we need to control in terms of existential risk, what are we not discussing? What are we leaving out? Issues like bias, issues like fair compensation for creators, issues like the effect on jobs, right? Issues of the access to healthcare that's not democratic, that can be lowered with greater coverage and better performance if we adopted AI. So I believe we need to invert the conversation. We have a moral imperative to use AI and apply it to human ends, to put human beings at the core. It is only an existential risk if we simply walk away from it, divorce our intelligence, and believe that we have no control. But we do. We simply need to exercise it. Thanks.
Thank you, Kenneth, and thanks to all of our speakers. Maybe we give them all another round of applause. And I sense that our speakers are itching to reply to each other, but maybe we can start with self-preservation and will to life. I wonder if one of Reuben and Chris has something to say about those points. Yep.
Okay, so Ken mentioned that it would come from the training data. That wasn't my argument at all. My argument was that it would be a logical inference, that something that has a goal and that rationally pursues it will rationally infer that it couldn't pursue it if it was switched off or if it was dead, if it was a human. This is not something that we would just pick up from the training data. If it did, it would be hilariously incapable of actually pursuing it, just like Bing Chat was when it had, or at least the appearances of, a self-preservation instinct.
So I'm saying this is a logical consequence of rational agents pursuing goals.
Chris, I'll let you rebut that if you want. You should, because I'm sure you don't agree with it.
Well, it's quite correct. And the point is that obviously evolved organisms have a will to life. Clearly. Machines can have any purpose or none at all. So Google search wants us to click on ads. Drones with terminal guidance want to kill the thing they're driving at. When I say want to, this means I can explain their behavior reasonably well in terms of assigning them a purpose and beliefs. That's the intentional stance. Machines can also, if we're unlucky, they're badly designed, or they are self-modifying, have behavior which is uninterpretable in that way at all. And I mean, a reinforcement learning system, which is, as Reuben pointed out to me, with the wrong value function, explaining it in any way, you cannot use the intentional stance to explain it because it has no consistent intentions. So the point is that machines can have many purposes, any purposes assigned to them. Controlling the purpose they do and designing it is something which it's entirely uncertain that we would be able to do. And of course, people might put the wrong purposes into those machines.
Yeah, this is an argument that's often heard about AI. Even if you're not a Bostrom hardliner believing in the paperclip maximizer, then perhaps you can accept the argument that AI adds jet fuel to anything a human can do, be that building a nuclear bomb or creating a pandemic. I wonder how seriously Kenneth and Jack take that argument.
So I take very seriously the idea that AI is likely to be used as a force maximizer for lots of powerful agents to exert their power in various ways. That, to me, is not an argument for a new category of existential risk. I mean, but maybe I'm misunderstanding, because every time I hear the discussion about existential risk, what the actual risk is seems to change. Are we talking about an AI controlling our nuclear weapons and blowing us up? Are we talking about an AI creating a pandemic? Or are we talking about, our robot overlords taking us? I just don't know. It's sort of, I don't know how to put my finger on the existential risk argument, and yet it receives so much attention, as does the idea of alignment and this very narrow sense of AI safety. It's not just receiving attention; it's receiving hundreds of millions of largely philanthropic dollars, and yet it doesn't. As soon as I try and work out exactly what the thing is, right? If I was a regulator, what would I be regulating? It sort of comes apart in my fingers. So, I mean, I would be really interested in the sort of computer scientist view of actually what the plausible steps, what are the actual ways that the world is going to end?
Yeah, I think we can handle this.
Okay, well, I think I mentioned tyranny. Now, tyranny is a very historically, probably the commonest form of government. Plenty of ruling groups have managed, with considerable difficulty, skill, determination, and ruthlessness, to set up tyrannies against which, at least for a time, rebellion is impossible for people underneath it. Well, how might AI? I mean, AI does not have any natural will to power, but AI can make setting up a tyranny really easy. There are all sorts of great tools. And this means that a tyranny can be set up by idiots, run by idiots, switched on, this is a stable end state, and this is a Bostromian stable end state, without anybody intending it to. Even the people who set it up can then be tyrannized. Now, you presuppose that people are going to be in charge. I presuppose that people are going to make horrendous mistakes. Right? And,
But is humanity extinct in that scenario? I mean, maybe I'm just misunderstanding maybe we've got different ideas about what we think an existential risk.
well, I think
is.
the answer is that I won't. That if there is a machine-run and enforced system of control, which people cannot successfully fight against, take this very hypothetical and weird example, then I mean, maybe people continue to exist a long time, maybe they don't, but this feels fairly existential to me.
Right. So this is the Skynet argument. Well, I don't want to. I mean, that's
No. I mean, sorry. Go ahead.
Well, I mean, I am. It is a backhanded way of characterizing it. I recognize, but let's sort of examine how you get to that. I think tyranny is a huge risk. I think politically you should be frightened by what we're seeing developing today, and with the capability of AI today and even tomorrow, handing it to people who are non-democrats, giving that power. Is a real recipe for disaster, we know from human history, and you can imagine it's going to be difficult to unwind that when they have that power. I think that the power, I don't think it's so totalizing as you make out, because these models are also in the open source, and you have the Jedi Knight rebellion. But the point is that the idea that you'd have this everlasting tyranny from a band of idiots, rather, who have created the machine, not where they're not in charge, no humans in charge, but only the machines are in charge, it's hard for me to plausibly see how that would actually happen. Mm-hmm. I mean, maybe I'm just a failure of imagination, but it just seems like there would be enough people who would feel rivalrous and want the control that giving it all to the machine just wouldn't be what would happen. It wouldn't. That doesn't feel realistic.
Again, sorry. I feel you're presupposing that people would be in charge, that what they intended would happen.
But you're presupposing that the machines are going to be in charge, and I doubt that. These are two equal presuppositions.
I'm saying that people can set into motion things which they later regret. Most wars, I think, are regretted.
In hindsight.
In hindsight.
Yeah.
And they happen because people think it's not going to be so bad. Now, as we are right now seeing, there has been a lot of talk about banning AI weapons, but they are being developed pretty much as fast as humanly possible and deployed. I don't see any prospect of successfully banning such weapons.
Let me pick up on that. I think we can meet each other halfway on this. I'm very nervous about lethal autonomous weapon systems, laws, ironically as they call it in the biz. But at the same time, if you look at where some countries have been using AI weapons, and of course we're at a very early stage on it, they're using it for ways that are making war more humane, as absolutely atrocious as I know that sounds. Okay? So just last week, a drone killed a Hezbollah commander in Iraq. Do people know about this? Okay, yeah, some people are nodding. Some people have no idea. Do you know what was interesting about that? You know, that awful, heinous, terrible attack, right? On an awful, heinous, terrible person, right? You could see images of the vehicle that the person was in being lifted onto sort of a bed and being towed away. So in the past, being only 10 years ago, you would have needed a guided missile to wipe out a city block to get that guy. Instead, they used a warhead that didn't have an explosive on it, but that had telescopic blades that sort of went in and whizzed the whole thing and sort of destroyed the vehicle that the person was in, not the collateral damage of a block. right? Or the whole marketplace. This is disgusting and heinous. Someone who doesn't like conflict, that would, I can't endorse this. But if you're going to have a world of conflict, using technology to minimize the casualties so that you're only getting the person who is the target and not all the other bystanders, that has to be something that you have to hold your breath and say, well, that's better than the alternative. So if you will, this is going to sound disgusting, I know, but it might as well be said because this is the real world. AI could possibly make conflict more humane, as paradoxical and atrocious as that sounds.
I feel the conversation is getting quite gendered here, actually.
Why? Is there
But,
talking about war?
No. How can I put this? Wars are going to be fought by robots. This is because where there is a conflict is going to be no place for human beings. This might make it humane in terms of immediate casualties, but I don't think it makes it less dangerous. And wars are destabilizing. The Great Wars have happened because nobody foresaw them and nobody wanted them to happen. What I want to return to the subject is that the events that are going to happen are going to be enormous, in that we make a transition of technology from something which is hard to produce to something which it is easy to produce. But something like the atomic bomb under the Manhattan Project, a good example, had to be built by tens of thousands of people. It was enormously difficult, required huge resources, and many minds were involved in working out methods of control and so on. The point about, we're saying not the next AI, but the one after that, is going to be more resourceful than people, manufacturing, automatic manufacturing, design and manufacturing itself. This makes the construction of equivalently complex or more complex systems enormously easier and vastly cheaper. And that is a huge change. It takes off a lot of the socio-technical controls, which are now kind of inherent in any large project. Now, what the effect of that is, I'm not sure, but we get to a point where living in a globally informative AI, as we nearly do at the moment with Google, is pretty pleasant. Living in a globally capable AI, I think there's existential risk. There are existential risks in that many of these safety mechanisms of society are kind of released.
Thank you, Chris. We're going to move into questions shortly. Before we do, I'd like to give every speaker a chance to give a closing view and one more response to the other side. Jack, should we start with you?
By way of summary, let me just say that there are some really, really important discussions that we need to have involving some difficult research. It's a real shame if instead of having those discussions, we spent our time talking about science fiction and we pretended that the relevant discussion here was a battle between humanity and our robot overlords. I like talking about science fiction. My worry at the moment is that a lot of the people talking about science fiction, talking very loudly about it and donating hundreds of millions of dollars to fund speculative research in scare quotes, into this, those people are sucking all of the oxygen out of the room. It makes it really hard. We've already seen it. We've already seen the British government get pulled away from some important discussions about artificial intelligence to talk about some of these speculative discussions. And then, thankfully, get pulled back by some more reasonable voices. But I think this tension between a sensible, reasonable discussion that is also very, very inconvenient for the people creating artificial intelligence, right? That's the discussion that needs to happen, not a speculative science fiction discussion that is extremely convenient for the people talking about artificial intelligence because it plays into their hands.
Thank you, Jack. Reuben? Sure. Okay, so this point of distraction, I think there is some merit to it, that these large AI companies are using this risk, this existential risk, as a distraction from the issues you brought up about misinformation, about training on copyrighted data. And I think that's a real shame that they've demerited the argument by doing that. It doesn't mean it's false. It just means it's convenient for them. Furthermore, on this problem of distraction, attention is not a finite resource. We have more attention to give to AI risks on all sides of the spectrum. And what this conversation of existential risk has done when it burst onto the scene about 6 months ago is it's raised the profile of all of these risks. It's not a competition for resources. The other angle to that is that while the beliefs and the goals might be distinct between people worried about more concrete present harms and speculative harms, the actions are surprisingly aligned. I would like to be able to look at a language model and understand where in that model is stored the knowledge of how to make mustard gas. Other people concerned about risks would like to look at that model and see how does it represent bias? How does it mitigate that? These kind of techniques to understand and control models will be useful both for current harms and for the long-term speculative harms, if you want to call them that. Ken brought up RLHF as an argument that we control these models. I think this belies some misunderstanding of what RLHF can really achieve. RLHF is the equivalent of sticking tape over the mouth of the large language model while leaving all of that knowledge intact. And the tape doesn't work very well. They're jailbroken all the time. Think of how much money AI companies must be pumping into trying to control their large language models. And they still can't get them to never give the recipe for mustard gas. It's this kind of control I would like us to research better with a bunch of that funding. And I think it will serve both near-term interests and long-term interests. Reuben, thank you. Ken, any closing words?
Yeah, who thought that the closing remarks were going to all be about mustard gas? So let me make a small point on that and then give the closing remarks. And I think it's going to be a better conversation over a single malt where we can really get to it over a long period of time. But I do feel compelled to actually answer this, which is, when I said that the training data was where you found your self-preservation, rather than what you said was a plausible inference, I was giving you a stronger argument, okay? Because when you said that it was a plausible inference, that means you had a feeling in the solar plexus. That you think that this is the case, right? When I say that it's in the training data, it's to say, no, it's baked in, it's there. I get it, self-preservation, it could be there. We don't know if it is, but I think it would be. The reason why is the training data is made out of human beings, and human beings have an instinct for self-preservation. So why wouldn't it be there? Mustard gas. It's not there, right? The whole point of it is, imagine we could go into the training data, and before we put in the training data, we got rid of everything that was related 100% to mustard gas. You're nodding, you know where this is headed. That we got rid of it all, nothing there. And then we had all of the stock of human knowledge that had been ever recorded since the beginning of time. Could it concoct mustard gas? And the answer is yeah, it would. In theory, it has to be able to actually have a conception of mustard gas, and we know this because we have created mustard gas based on all of the stock of human knowledge. So somewhere in the word embeddings and the connections is mustard gas. Now, of course, the point of existential risk is somewhere in these embeddings is some sort of plague that has literally no antidote, that wipes people out in a second, and that it could actually wipe us all out. That's the point, that in the embeddings of the AI is this possibility. It's there. I'll accept it. So does Melanie Mitchell. The point is that the idea that it's going to be used as an existential risk is not zero, but so exceedingly small that we're talking about the wrong thing when we focus on it, not other things. So I would conclude in my remarks with simply this. Where do we actually find agreement? Because that's a really interesting place of overlap. And the first is that we agree that AI represents a new era for humanity and is going to, I would think, and that it is highly performant, will do extraordinary things. We agree that we don't know how it's actually going to develop and that we need to be humble before it. We agree that there is a distractionary element of existential risk, although Nick Bostrom's book is from 10 years ago, not just 6 months, so we've been talking about this for a long period of time. But where we disagree is on the level of risk. It is a risk, but it's not existential. It's one that we need to care about, but not at the expense of many other things.
Thank you, Ken. And as a last minute warning, if you want to submit a question, then I think time might be running out. Now's your time. Chris, haven't forgotten you. Closing remarks.
Exponentials, they creep up on you. You don't notice them, then they whoosh past. At the moment, large language models aren't dangerous. We have a large language model which can learn physics from reading one book, as opposed to not learning physics from reading 100,000 books. Then we can't regulate what hasn't been invented yet. That doesn't mean it's not going to be invented. It doesn't mean it's irrational to look forward. And actually, I find myself in enormous agreement that very careful thought and regulation about risks that are appearing may reveal gradually many risks which might appear later. So I completely agree that very active and proactive regulation and oversight of AI now is maybe the best thing we can do.
Wonderful. Well, thank you very much to all our speakers. Time for audience questions.
Yeah, I think because a few of the questions in the Menti have already been answered, I think we'll just go with people putting their hands up and speaking. Yeah, so maybe you can choose.
Okay, up there. Can you and raise your voice? Yeah.
So I'm also a social scientist, and to me a lot of the things that seem to pose risk from AI are actually themselves relating to economic or social systems that are in place, not AI itself. Like, we've got biases in our data. Okay, well that's because of the social ways that we put racism in our data. We're like using loads of energy to run all of our servers. Okay, that's because we like encourage extractivism. So I'm also just kind of not getting how AI is amplifying these sufficiently to cause death, to cause extinction. Like, I'd really appreciate if you could walk me through every single step of like, right, what groups are vulnerable to this if we're considering AI a hazard that we're vulnerable to? Like, what groups getting affected first? How are we ultimately dying? Like, I would really appreciate that being walked through, and how it's not actually just another way that we're amplifying existing systems that encourage particular inequalities.
So my argument is essentially that we might lose control of AI systems, and that it would be hubris to predict what would happen after that. Just like there are multiple primates, and we won out over the bonobos, and now we're like totally destroying their ecosystem. The bonobos could never have predicted in what exact ways they would have gotten extinct, but they could have made a pretty solid prediction, which was this other species of primate doesn't have the same goals as us, and this other primate is far more intelligent and capable than us. And from that, it's just natural to conclude that, well, their goals are going to win out over ours. Now, the analogy with AI here is that there will be economic incentives to create goal-driven AI systems, that we do not yet currently possess the techniques to ensure that those goals are the goals we desire. even if we could do that, it would be hopeless because goals are multifaceted. There's a huge plurality of goals and values in the human species, and we could not capture all of that and then put it in an AI system. So now you have something that's goal-driven. You can't ensure it has the same goals as you have, and ultimately it's more intelligent and more capable. It's just then natural to conclude that it will win out in pursuing its goals over you pursuing your goals. Now, I want to emphasize, I do not mean a robot apocalypse, I do not mean robot overlords, and I do not mean a paperclip maximizer. I mean a kind of intelligence that can hit us at our weak spots, the kind of weak spots that we already observe, such as misinformation, such as weakening our common understanding of what's going on in the world. If every person has their own AI assistant that helps them understand the world, give them news, organize their life, reply to their emails, if companies, because of economic pressures, give over control of their companies to more powerful intelligences as AI systems, but don't get the goal match quite right, then you've now got AIs running companies, making money on the stock market. And eventually, I mean, I don't understand how you can confidently say that this doesn't end badly. I'm not saying it does, I'm just saying there's a risk. And I would say at least 5% just to pull a number out of the hat.
To hear Reuben say this, I have to accept that as a parent of a 16-year-old, AI is an existential risk. Nobody got that. Wait until your parents. You'll understand what I meant by that.
We had a chap up there in the yellow with a question.
Yeah, so this is my response to Jack's question on sort of how does it actually kill us all? And I think that that's the main response I get from everyone who doesn't kind of believe in the existential risk thing, is the actual implementation. And I think that there's a clear example which, I mean, it can happen tomorrow at the very stage we have right now. If you think, for example, a narrow AI system, I mean, Google DeepMind, they train this all the time. We're not talking language models here, we're talking systems which have been trained on quantities of data, so for protein folding, so AlphaFold, or material science, for example. We could train a system that's, say, on all of biomedical knowledge, all of biomedical science, and then you could prompt that system, and let's assume it's good enough, right? How do I create a virus or modify said virus so that it kills all carbon-based life, and there's no cure, right? Even adding words, and there's no cure, means that it might have no cure, right? And then the only barrier, once you get the instructions, is the implementation. And any sufficiently bad actor, some nation state somewhere in the world, could design this and probably will end up designing this. And then all it takes is a lab leak, and we know what happens when that happens. So my point is there are many pathways to actual existential risk, which require no robots, no huge future AI, no large compute or anything, just pure, simple, it could be a mistake even. You know, someone asks the wrong thing and it gets out there. But there are legitimate ways in how you could kill every single person on the planet, and it's just pure biology, I guess. Yeah, so that would be my response to you, and I'd ask you what your response is to that kind of existential risk, and if you feel like that poses a threat or answers your question.
No. I think that's very exciting if you're looking for the plot for the next Mission Impossible movie, right? I'm not sure that's a reason to. And I'm not sure that feels like the sort of threat that we have regulatory tools in place to govern. I mean, I don't buy the argument that is a new category of risk beyond just existing risks of bioterror and bioerror and all the rest of it. I mean, yeah, absolutely, we should watch out for it. But it's this point about, you know, what would be the switch that turns these risks into, you know, things that we should worry about, and then suddenly we're wiping out all of humanity. And it's that switch that I think is so interesting, and I can sort of see the reasons why people highlight that switch, and it's because they don't want to engage with the actual politics of artificial intelligence.
Yeah, we'll have a quick reply
So, yeah,
and then move on.
Small follow-up. I think the kind of the thing we'll have, you know, just saying it's like a science fiction plot. Well, it's not. It's a logical set of deductions. You know, biological engineering is possible. Language models can invent new science. So once you start to combine these things to the point where you have language models creating new biology, well then it's just a case of scaling it up and doing it much better. And you say regulation will capture those things. Regulation didn't stop COVID. I mean, assuming it is, a lab-generated disease, and we can, that's another debate. But I think that's my point there is regulation is pointless in a world where I can send you something that can end the world in an email. It's different to a nuclear bomb, it's different to a drug. I can send you something that can contain the knowledge to kill everyone in an email.
I mean,
Not
only would I say that regulation definitely is not pointless, I would say, that we need to work harder.
I'm saying against this threat, sorry. You can't regulate against that particular threat. The bad actor chooses to do this. They will get around the regulation because you cannot stop someone. It's not uranium. You can't protect it. That's the the problem with the regulation argument against this example.
Yeah, don't buy it. Regulation is a really interesting one though, and Chris made the point that you can't regulate something that doesn't exist, and actually we do all the time do exactly that, come up with laws that then shape particular technologies in particular directions, and you could argue that, in fact, I would argue that the large language models that we have at the moment are the product of a set of rules that that ascribe responsibility in certain ways, that create economic incentives towards certain things. Now, whether or not you see that as sort of regulation in the sense of health and safety executive type regulation is a different thing. But I think one of the most interesting things about the AI that we have at the moment is that it is a product of a set of rules that shaped the internet that we have today, and shaped a particular media environment that we have today, that shaped incentives towards creating companies that captured our attention and monetized it and all the rest of it. So I would say that you can equally tell a story in which regulation comes first.
I know that Ken might have some comments on this. Okay, we had a fellow up there. What's the question? Loud voice, please.
So, a couple of years ago, there was an AI lab that researched how to develop new drugs based on chemical compounds. And their goal for that was positive drugs that would improve health. They decided to change the goal to maximize toxicity in the drugs. And within 6 hours, they found over 40,000 chemical compounds, many of which were already known to be highly toxic. Many more were unknown to science at that point. So you already have an algorithm that can create tens of thousands of highly toxic chemical compounds in 6 hours. It'd be very easy to integrate that into a large language model, like you said. And then you can just ask, create me the most toxic chemical compound. All you need then is some dodgy research lab in some country that wants to cause unrest. And you can't legislate against that. They're halfway across the world, and you're legislating in England.
Jan, Ken, any response to that?
Well, I mean, Ken, you have a go.
Thank you. So, yeah, it's a huge risk. So that was a paper from about 2 years ago in Nature. It's probably 2019, 2020, 2019. What was it?
2022.
2022. Okay, so it was a Nature paper, right? Exactly. They just ran it backwards, if you will. Yeah, I was frightened as well, like everyone. I guess where I come down, which is definitely unsatisfying for me, probably unsatisfying for you as well, is that similar to the issue with nuclear reactors, which you can go to any UCL library and learn how to build them, and you could build it, you could get your hands on, whether you can get the material or not, the uranium is another question. But to actually build a nuclear bomb, it's a known thing, it's open, you can find it out. But if you try to purchase the high-end material to do it, it's all encumbered with export controls or even import controls, just sales controls. So if I would wonder whether if it's a pathogen or if it's a compound, whether we are already regulating the sort of the toxic ones, or the ones that are known to be problematic, that could be used for this purpose in a form that is sufficient, that you have to go through a lot of hoops to evade those rules. But you're going to follow up, so.
Yeah. Couldn't you easily ask for a new chemical compound that is unregulated? But,
potential, right? Yeah. I mean, that's right. I mean, I would hope that there is enough of a surveillance system that would be able to would be able to pick that up? Well, keep in mind, a lot of these sort of scenarios are ones that could already happen today if there was a sufficiently bad actor who wanted to do it. You could just do it with TNT and fertilizer, like Timothy McVeigh and bomb a building.
But for nuclear warheads, we know that Iran, North Korea, Iran for sure, North Korea probably have nuclear warheads. The difficulty there is the delivery system.
Yep.
The delivery system here is not relevant at all. It's instant. You don't have to worry about that aspect, and that is currently the biggest preventative measure of nuclear warheads going off in Europe is the delivery mechanism.
So, I mean, there's a fatalism that you get to, right? It's almost like the game of Risk or some other scenario planning where all lines lead to death and destruction and the planet just being sort of a black icy ball rotating in the universe. What would you do if we accept the fact that it is an existential risk? Do we stop AI altogether? Do we all have like a chip embedded in ourselves so if we even concoct a thought of doing this that it gets registered? I mean, how realistic, to what degree should we be so concerned about it that we sort of distort all of our civil society
I think we may have already crossed the river for that.
So it's just a matter of time. We're on a ticking time bomb. The doomsday clock is, I mean, maybe, right? I mean,
For people in Japan, it was.
I'm not going to say that we're talking moonshine because we know what happens when you do that. The very next day, it happens. So, but I accept the fact that to me, it's I'm worried in the same way you're worried too. Yeah.
Oh, there, right at the back.
Hello. I think there could be an interesting concept to introduce, which is...
Speak up, please.
Okay. I want to introduce the concept of distance. Essentially, something like, for example, trying to gather uranium materials in real life, in physical form, is likely going to be expensive, and there are literal physical walls that will prevent you from doing so. Now, compare that to something like the internet, which has almost has no concept of distance. What is to stop the person, like the person to the right of me said, trying to do a prompt or creating a 10 chemical, and then asking that same prompt, can it be made with household ingredients? And then from there on, the information would be very cheap to transfer. Where, say, trying to gather physical uranium is likely going to be expensive to smuggle.
There's a comment.
Can I repitch this slightly? I think the speculation on various acceleration of threats that we already have in an existing manner is just part of it. Essentially, tyranny has existed probably for 3,000 years in the form of religion in one way or another, and it's just moving to the next step. My question comes, and I have background in military intelligence, of actually on the Rumsfeldian logic, is real existential risks that in our unknown unknowns, what can these systems find that we are not aware exists at the moment, and how do we understand that they have found them before something comes out of it?
Maybe Chris can take that.
Yes, I completely agree with you. My question is, what is the place of us humans in a world where there will be intellectually and physically super capable machines? And the answer is, I don't know. I think it's, the veil, the curtain is drawn across the future. We don't know what it's like. We're getting just a few inklings when you ask ChatGPT to write a program. Suddenly your intent gets translated into technology. Now, for the other speakers, and of course these things are possible already, but AI is, I think, force amplifier is a word, makes doing a lot of these difficult technological things, or future AI, which I'm talking about, makes doing these difficult technological things a whole lot easier. It's a little like there was a moral panic a few years ago about distributing blueprints for metal printing of guns, so to make gun control impossible. Well, this didn't amount to much, and probably they're not very good guns, and you have to buy a printer, which is more expensive than a gun. Guns are not easy to get. But again, there is a real problem that these things are very hard to regulate. There is a real problem with open source software, which is very hard to regulate. And at the moment, there are all sorts of fascinating social reasons why open source software is mostly, but not entirely, beneficial. If the software itself becomes more capable and self-modifying, it's a very interesting question as to whether those social factors will continue to hold. Sorry, audience, does it?
Yes, I have a question for kind of the leaders and the whole super intelligence argument.
Can you make sure everyone can hear your question, please?
Yeah, sorry. I have a question for the camp that believes in the super intelligence argument. We briefly had this example of removing kind of all knowledge of mustard gas from the entirety of human text, and then some language model being able to refine that knowledge, so to speak, and it being embedded in like all of its connections. I think the way it was phrased earlier was that we would need to find learning rules that are better than biological learning rules within neurons, which to me, I'm feeling skeptical about that not being that being more than just maybe finding mustard gas 10 times. Can you speak to that, like as a theoretical obstacle that would come up for this whole plan towards?
So, sorry, is your argument, how does it discover its own threats? And how could it do it on a bigger scale than mustard gas? I'm not quite sure I
No, I
understood.
think it's positive. It's super intelligence. If it can find mustard gas, why can't it find amazingly incredible new discoveries that we never knew about before? Is that right?
How is it going to find patterns that are very far from patterns that you could find in the data?
Yeah. So these models already extrapolate. There's no such thing, or it's very hard to pin down what interpolation means in extremely high dimensions. So they already have an element of creativity. Deep learning just wouldn't work unless there was an element of generalization, an element of creativity, of learning rules that abstract from the training data to novel scenarios. And even simple models like language models can do this to an extent. So they're good at playing chess. There's no way you can get good at playing chess by memorizing games online. The number of games is just too large. You need to be able to generalize. And the argument I'm making is that this generalization ability is pretty primitive in large language models, but it's the goal of AI. It's the thing that the whole field is aimed at. There's no reason to suppose that we'll hit some limit that's below human capability. It might take a long time. I don't want to make predictions on how long, but it will happen eventually. I think you can say that with more than 10% confidence at the very least.
I think we've got time for a couple more questions, I think. You in the turtleneck was the first to put your hand up.
First, just the way I understand the discussion is not that much about if AI is an existential threat, but it's rather about if it increases the existential threat. And as I understand, most of the panelists agree with that, if not all. Like maybe that will be another question I want to ask right now. But what I actually want to ask is, if we assume that it increases the existential threat, why do we still keep pushing it that much? Why not, like with the World War II and nuclear bombs, there was a threat of chain reaction, and we still did it because there was another existential threat that, well, the country won't exist and there would be no one to care about. So this was like valid too. But now there is no existential threat, it feels like. So we're just doing this for fun and testing our luck. Or like, why are we having this discussion and not just taking it cautiously? Because we have time, we have generations to grow and develop. Like, well, what's going on? Maybe that's another question or whoever wants to take.
It's the same dynamic, just with companies rather than states. The existential threat is going bankrupt, not existing, being outcompeted.
Okay. If I may, like, why do companies decide our future and not governments?
Because companies ignore governments.
Okay, we're going to conclude with a bonus 4-question rodeo. So we're going to get 4 questions from the audience, and then each of the panelists will have an opportunity to answer the question they're choosing. Up there.
A lot of the more recent discussion, I'm oversimplifying a little bit, in particular when it came to biological weapons or something, the left side seemed to be a little saying something like arguing against safety measures by saying, oh yeah, we're going to be fine because the systems won't be dangerous because they will have safety measures implemented. So I'm like a little bit like thinking, what is the actual disagreement there? Because I think everyone is kind of presupposing that some kind of regulation is necessary. Is this then just some gradual disagreement, basically?
Okay, that's the first question, and yes, question number 2.
Imagine this was the year 1974. So computers are getting faster, computers are getting more powerful, and we could reasonably be having a talk in UCL about how computers might be an existential threat to humanity. In hindsight, they were a huge threat to humanity. They made many terrible things, many big changes, but I think that calling it an existential threat wasn't very correct. Does this apply to AI too, or why is this different otherwise?
Okay, next one, and just a couple of sentences if you can, please.
Thank you. So I guess risks only become existential if they're not mitigated. And what I can kind of gather from the panel is that there's emerging like a cognitive dissonance between AI practitioners and probably policymakers or those with large amounts of capital. And that kind of cognitive dissonance might lead to dangerous AI development. And therefore, should the correct framing be that we should be worried about AI, and we should deem it an existential threat so that we start putting in mechanisms in our society that we can mitigate against possible risks. But I also acknowledge that there may be unknown elements.
Okay, and one more, please. Yes.
I wanted to ask a little bit about race dynamics and the risk that AI might have on great power conflict rather than AI being an existential risk in and of itself, kind of along the arguments of Robert Trager at Oxford, and whether you think that AI as an important technology in shifting the balance of international power might increase the risk of great power conflict that could in theory be existential.
Okay, and we're going to add a couple more, but be speak with as much brevity as you can, please. Yes, up there.
I mean, if we have the energy and time to talk about, the existential threats as if they were happening now, then surely we also have, we can also devote it to thinking about exponential solutions, for example. I mean, Chris said, if we knew what would have happened, the Manhattan Project, we wouldn't have carried on with it. So why can't we treat like the AI project in a similar way? We kind of know what the future looks like, not exactly, but if we're sure that some kind of threat is going to happen, then surely we have the means to implement some kind of measures to stop that from happening.
Okay, one more, and then our panelists will. Yes, with the heel bottle.
Yeah. So there seems to, I think there's a trend in like the past few questions about AI being misused rather than posing an existential threat in and of itself. And I wanted to get the panelists' opinion on like whether you think misuse or AI, independent AI is a bigger threat in the long term and the short term.
Okay, great. Thank you, everyone. Jack, is there anything in those questions that you'd like to pick out or respond to?
There's lots. I mean, I'm really troubled that you think that we're arguing against regulation. I am really interested in a dynamic where the people that are most keen to talk about existential risk loudly, people like Elon Musk and Sam Altman and co, are also those people that are least interested in genuine democratic regulation. So yes, Sam Altman will appear before Congress and say regulate us, but he means regulate us in ways that cement his company's power, not in the public interest. I think real regulation really matters. I'm really interested, and I think, again, a point of agreement, and something I want to follow up on with what Reuben was saying about whether there are, even if you disagree on the characterization of risks, whether there are actions that we can take that take us to a good place. You know, I've presented it as a sort of tension, and I'm reassured that there might actually be a view that maybe doesn't see it as a tension. You know, I think one of the things that experts closest to the technology can do is ring alarm bells, but I don't think that those experts should also be the people that tell us what to do next, because that's not what they know about, right? That's why we need regulators. That's why we need governments and people acting, representing the public interest. And just a final point about the Manhattan Project that I think tells us something quite interesting about these dynamics, these race dynamics that you were highlighting. Halfway through the Manhattan Project, they did know. They did know that the initial reason why they had started their project was no longer valid, right? They realized that Germany had failed to develop a bomb. At that point, many of the scientists and military leaders kept on going. One of those scientists, Joe Rotblat, left the Manhattan Project at that point and is one of the rare scientists to have won a Nobel Peace Prize. He's a really, really interesting figure, willing to challenge that sort of race dynamic that had been set up by other people. A dynamic of a race is in the interests of the people that are developing the technology, right? But it's a rubbish race because actually they don't know where they're going. They might say they're heading towards AGI, but you ask them what that is and they aren't able to tell you, right? What they're actually racing towards is market dominance, which is something that, yes, we should be really, really concerned about, and something that regulators and regulatory design is required in order to tackle, which might include some very, very old-fashioned tools like antitrust, right? It might include holding people to account for copyright violations, right? These might be old tools, not new ones. So I think the sooner we can empower regulators to address genuine risks, the better.
Chris, anything you'd like to say in response to these
Yeah,
questions?
1974, I remember it well. And wouldn't it be unfortunate? But most of the time, technology has been good for us. Technology is great. You've got electric light, comfortable place to sit. We're not under in some forest. So that's entirely true and a good point. I think there was a great power competition. You betcha. We're entering a very chaotic economic times. Was there a technological determinism question? I don't get it. I don't believe at all that the systems we produce are simply those that suit the purposes of the companies. I think the companies have accidentally discovered uses for things which have been invented very largely. The reason we don't know what AGI looks like is because it hasn't been invented yet. But there are pretty good reasons for thinking that it will. I'm sorry, there was another question. That was your question. What was that?
What kind of practical solutions?
Yeah, why don't we stop? We're too curious. And I find the interesting battle from the company's point of view is open source. These huge companies are terribly keen on open source. Why? That I do believe it makes everything impossible to regulate or control if it's open source. It's out of the box. You can't stop anything. And small organizations can take the latest advances, do whatever they like with them, and governments are chasing behind on flat feet. So I'm sorry, it's curiosity.
There's no solution. I mean, what's the point of talking about this if we're all going to die? So there must be something we can do.
Okay, I don't want to go in. We're talking risks, not certainties. And the future is behind a veil, we really don't know. So I wouldn't, the reason why we can't see the immediate path to doom, because perhaps there isn't an inevitable path to doom, but there are what I hope will be side roads to doom. Okay?
Thank you, Chris. Ken.
Great. So first, thanks to the audience, because these are incredible questions. And I think if we've learned one thing tonight, no one up front has the answers, and we're simply mirroring your same concerns. and benefiting from your insights. Likewise, to all 5 of us, or 4 of you on stage, thank you. Deeply fascinating. I think it comes down to first how we judge risk, right? And what we mean by that. Philip Tetlock, who's sort of the father of what's called super forecasting and has studied for the last 40 years, 30 years, forecasts, has come to many really revealing conclusions. And one of the most important is that people who are in the industry of something, people who are closest to the problem, are actually the worst forecasters of that situation. And when he looks at AI, he sees this in spades. What he sees is that the people who are signing, as we saw, the Declaration, the Demis Hassabis's and the Sam Altmans and Elon Musk, the people who are deeply in it are the most worried, but also the least good at forecasting. Part of the reason why, not the entire reason, but part of it is that they see the world, they chose to go into that industry because they found it to be incredibly appealing, right? Incredibly important, in fact, so important that there's a natural tendency to over-dramatize the importance of that industry. So they can't help but look at AI and imagine it having agency, and therefore being the most important thing in all of humanity, as important as fire, as one Silicon Valley executive once put it, and therefore imagining the obvious risks that it entails. But the point about existential solutions, just sort of in a reframing of it, is quite interesting because it reminds us that we are actually in control, that we have agency, that we can shape how technology develops, and we can actually use all of our tools, from our values to our regulation, to direct the technology in the way it goes. Self-driving cars are a good example. We know we will have truly autonomous vehicles when it doesn't pick us up to take us to work, but instead goes to the beach on its own. I don't imagine that happening. And as a result, that's why I score as lower the existential risk argument, while accepting there are a lot of risks.
Thank you, Ken, and we'll finish with Reuben.
All right, I think the question that piqued my interest most was, why is this risk different to other risks that were foreseen in the past, which didn't transpire? Okay. I think the real difference here is we're creating a second intelligence, or ultimately will create that. All these other technologies that we've created, we've understood pretty much exactly how they work. Yes, the iPhone is extremely complicated, nobody understands the whole thing, but for every part, there's an expert on that part that can predict exactly what it will do in every different circumstance. I think it hasn't really hit home with the public yet that this is just not how AI works since the deep learning revolution in 2016. I think people still have this perception of AI researchers writing lots of lines of code. Oh, if someone writes this prompt, then we'll reply with this. And oh, here's a formula for making a poem on every different topic imaginable. And here's a list of a rhyming dictionary so that it can write it. It just doesn't work like that. It has trillions of tiny little dials, and we train it over enormous quantities of data. And every time it guesses a word, we tweak the little dials until it's more likely to guess that next word correctly. And we can do this without knowing what each dial does. You tune it up, if it gets better, you leave it like that. If it gets worse, you tune it down and leave it like that and move on to the next word. You have no idea how the final system works. So if we end up ticking off these capabilities of, we started off with translation and all the language-based ones, but if we go and end up getting emotional manipulation, we already have the rudiments of that with ChatGPT, superhuman persuasiveness, strategic thinking, situational understanding, long-term reasoning and planning, then you really have to realize you're reckoning with a different kind of entity. A black box that can plan, a black box whose capabilities are unpredictable, and a black box which, despite RLHF, we do not yet have a good method of control.
Reuben, thank you. Thanks again to all the panelists for your informed and perceptive arguments, and thanks to you guys as well. I'll say exactly the same with your questions.